Hi, everybody. This is Bob. I'm back with the MakerSource podcast, where we talk to all people and all things related to the startup world. Very excited today to be welcoming Mary Juetten from Traklight. Got a great application that she's going to talk to us about, and hopefully she'll even share with us a few stories of experiences from startups that she's worked with and have kind of gone down good and bad paths. So, Mary, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Bob. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. So, sorry, do you want to tell us just a little bit about Traklight?
Sure. Well, I'll just tell you a little bit about my background. Is a little bit diverse, and I've got an accounting background, a law background. I worked in corporate America and ran some sort of as an entrepreneur, but in-house, so an intrapreneur, ran a couple of cool divisions of very large companies. And then after I went back to law school, I came up with the idea for a TurboTax-like application or platform for figuring out your intellectual property. So that's the genesis of Traklight, and that was about 7 years ago that I had the idea. So we've been around as a company with a launch product for about 5 years now. So it's an intellectual property and making sure that the hard work that inventors and entrepreneurs put into their businesses actually pans out is what we're all about.
Okay, so and it's interesting when you talk about IP, because I know in the startup space, a lot of entrepreneurs and startups go, oh yeah, I know I have to file a patent. But there's a lot more to the full IP picture than just a patent, isn't there?
There is, and one of the things that we ran into as we were building the product, we worked, of course, doing that kind of whole lean startup model and customer discovery type approach. We talked with a lot of startups, particularly in Arizona, because that's where we started in Phoenix. And so many people, I used to joke, if I had $1 for everyone who told me, oh, I don't have any IP because I don't have a patent, I wouldn't even need to get out of bed in the morning. But in all seriousness, what we have is a lot of early stage entrepreneurs who think, oh, I'll raise the money to get the patent, or I'll deal with this a little bit later. But unfortunately, even with patents, it's not something that you can put off. And there's patents, and then there's trademarks and copyright, but trade secrets are a little bit of the unsung heroes. And the trick with them is that once they're no longer secret, they lose their value really quickly. So, we have lots of resources on our website that talk about how to discover your IP and everything like that. But in short, your intellectual property or intangible assets are about 90% of your value when you're a startup and early stage company. So it makes a lot of sense to identify them and then use some of our partners to protect them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it's something that I think a lot of founders kind of miss early on, because they think, I've had this idea, it's a revolutionary idea, it's going to change the world, and to your point, I can figure all that stuff out after because it's so unique. But really, when we look at the market today, there aren't a lot of products or even software, app, anything, that you can point to that doesn't have a direct competitor doing something very similar. And so, that IP, that secret sauce that makes your product different is really that much more important. And it was interesting to hear you talk about, kind of the trade secrets and then also some of the stuff besides patents. So could you kind of go into just some examples of, what IP other than a patent might be for the people who are listening and would say, gosh, I never thought of that?
Well, I'll just start with trade secrets.
Mm-hmm.
We had a client that came to us and was like, hey, I have this juice company, so I don't have any IP. And we said, well, hey, use our questionnaire, go through it and see what you discover. And she was shocked because she, of course, had these trade secret recipes. And she was in the process of interviewing people to come to work and to manage this bricks and mortar store. And she was not having those people sign any kind of document that they wouldn't, if they came in and started training, that they wouldn't leave with that trade secret. And there was a big, huge case about the whole bring your own device with Zynga, the game company, and it keeps happening with them. I was looking at something the other day. They had somebody leave with 14,000 files on a USB. So think about it. So what happens is if you have bring your own device, then, you've got your little Dropbox and it's nothing against Dropbox or Box, but you've got that little icon up on the top of your computer. So if you've got your computer in, you can just take company secrets and throw them either on that USB or, up in the top bar. And if you're the company owner, if you haven't identified those trade secrets, put in policies and put in writing with your employees saying, the following things are our trade secrets, and you basically have to keep those confidential. If you haven't done all of that and you haven't followed the correct policy, nothing to do with filing anything with the government, but if you haven't done that work, if somebody does steal something, then you're not going to be able to make a case. So it's one of those things where people think, trade secrets, whatever. We're all friends now. And if I had $1 for every one of those type of stories where it's all the co-founders are all happy at the beginning. So the trade secret one is the one that you don't register. But think of Coca-Cola. That's a hugely valuable trade secret. So then around trademarks and branding, this is an area where I've unfortunately seen quite a few horror stories, and really linked to companies that they create a cool product, they come up with a cool name for it, or they set up their website for their product or their service, and they've done something cute like, change the top level domain so it's .me, but they've used another name that sounds a lot like their competitors. And so companies think when they get a website that allows them to do business or, to sell using that name. It's not true. I mean, a trademark, basically, when Coca-Cola went out and got their trademark, that means that when I open a bottle that has Coca-Cola branding on it, I'm assured that it's going to taste, I don't drink Coke, but it's going to taste, I drink Diet Coke. So it's going to be Diet Coke. It's not going to be the store generic brand, and it's not going to be Pepsi. So it's the same thing. If you have a product that you've come up with a clever name that confuses the public, you're not going to be allowed to use it. You'll never be able to trademark it. And in fact, you'll probably get a cease and desist letter from somebody else. And what happens with startups is they get excited. They go out and they buy shirts or they spend money on branding, and they have to redo it all because they haven't figured out and done a trademark search or done just a general internet search on that type of IP.
Two things that just kind of jumped out right away, and the first was when talking about the Zynga case and the ease and depth of kind of this intellectual property that may be electronic, where if I were to say, can you imagine someone walking into your office and walking out with 14,000 chairs? You would just sort of chuckle because it's utterly ridiculous. But for someone to take 14,000 files, they needed just a tiny USB drive, and then you think about the value to a company of that many files and everything that's on there, and what could happen to a company that didn't have the protection they need.
Right, and around the whole patent area, one of the things that led me to creating Traklight was a real life clinic client. When I was in law school, we did this tech ventures clinic, and this client of ours had two co-founders or co-inventors, and they had filed their patents. So that wasn't the issue. They'd filed it properly, because in the US, you have to file patents are filed personally, and all the inventors must be listed. However, they did not do the basics before they filed the patent. They didn't create a business entity. They didn't create any sort of co-founder agreement. So when they had a co-founder falling out, they had one co-founder that was disagreeing with how they were going to monetize the patent. The patent was in each of their names. It was not, there was no business entity. So the usual course is you file your patents as inventors, and then you do something that's called an assignment. It's literally, you check a box and it can get assigned as you're filing your patent to a business entity. Well, because they didn't do this, in the US, it means that everyone, there were 3 co-founders, so every one of those 3 co-founders could independently go and strike up a deal to monetize their invention. So it means that the disgruntled one could go off and sign a worldwide exclusive license for the technology, and the other 2 would have nothing to do about it. And it sounds extreme, but it actually happens more than you realize, and it's because they skipped over the somewhat mundane, boring steps of creating a business entity and then coming up with a operating agreement if it's an LLC or a shareholders agreement, and then coming up with a co-founder agreement that includes something that provides for that almost inevitable co-founder disputes. You have to have ways of resolving these disputes. So that was what led me to creating Traklight, because I was sitting in a different class, but with some of my classmates from the clique. I was like, why is it so hard? Like, they didn't fail on the expensive part, the filing the patent. They failed on the basic part, where they just could have gone and created an LLC for $50 at the time.
Right? It's you found the beauty in the mundane. You looked at the IP, and you had referred to it as kind of the TurboTax of IP, and I think you're right. When people stop and think about I'm going to do a startup, they think I'm going to be an entrepreneur. It's going to be glamorous. I'm going to travel. There's going to be all this money, and if you were to talk to them about this IP side, you would probably get a very sort of visceral reaction where they just kind of went, "Oh, that sounds awful." But in terms of where they could go wrong and just how awful things could go for them, it's so disproportionately important for them to consider this. And one of the things that you've mentioned twice now that I want to get into, because I think there could be some folks who are listening who have not yet been smart enough to take advantage of Traklight, is that you've talked about how the questionnaire sort of helped some folks discover IP that they previously hadn't recognized as IP. And if you could just tell us a little bit more kind of about the Traklight process and how getting into it can help these startups uncover assets that they may not have realized they had.
Sure. And so we initially started by having our entire platform being paid. And, it's not a lot of money, but we had it so that it was paid. And we spent years educating people around intellectual property. But then we decided that rather than argue with people whether they had intellectual property, we would make a portion of the questionnaire free so that they could assess what we called business risk. And really what we did is we pulled out the pieces so really what we did was we pulled out the pieces that are foundational to the running and to the management or mitigation of the risk in your actual business. So those are things around, for example, when you start, let's say you came up with this really cool idea for a piece of hardware, but you work for a company that is in the hardware business. First thing you should be doing is looking at your employment contract, because it would be very sad to work very hard only to find out that everything that you invent, whether it's the weekend or not, is the property of the company that you work for. So what Traklight does is it starts off by asking you those type of questions, like, who are you? What, do you have a company? Are you working for someone else? Have you looked at your employment agreement? And then it moves through things like, do you have contractors? Do you have employees yet? So the free part of it really is all about the foundational pieces. They all have to do with intellectual property. So, for example, if you don't have any non-disclosure agreements with your suppliers and you go out and you give them a prototype and it's not covered by anything, don't be surprised if perhaps they copy your products. So there's all these things that people don't think of as IP, but we just prefer to think of them as business risk so that people will actually complete the questionnaire. So the free part of it lines you up, and there's lots of questions around what you're planning to do. So that way, you can figure out and assess your risk. You get a cool grade, just like in school, about how ready you are to grow or raise money. And then the idea is the paid portion. We ask you questions about whatever you're inventing, whatever you're creating, and we also allow you to keep track of any IP that you've already protected.
So each user gets sort of a customized experience in the sense that the questions and the information, everything that's being stored, is going to directly apply to whatever it is they're trying to do with their company. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So what happens is you have a platform, you get a grade, and then if you want to learn how to solve we actually literally have X's for things like, for example, if you were the company that I described in the clinic, you would get a big red flag that you need a business entity. And then you can just click right on that red flag, and then you can go over to, we have a lot of external resources, and I know with MakerSource, we've got external resources there. So the idea is you could go through the free part and figure out what you need to address before you could go to the paid part. And the paid part, if you're in there and you put in a bunch of information on your invention, but it's you're thinking of going out and exhibiting at a trade show, you're going to get a red flag around that. Plus, if you look on your dashboard, you have this very detailed report, which is not meant to be printed. It's meant to be reviewed online. And what you do is you look there, and it gives you all the business advice that you need on what your next step should be to protect your IP. And you'll get a cool chart, too, that shows you how many potential trademarks, how many potential copyrights, patents, and all of that you have. And you can use that to hopefully make sure that you protect everything.
That's so great. And I think one of the things that I like the most about this personally is just that you saw this need and created this product and this solution that is, while it's applicable for everyone, it has a real sweet spot in the kind of startup and entrepreneur space, because there is so little out there right now to educate that group around the importance of exactly what it is you're trying to do. So I will say on behalf of the community that this is a terrific product, and I hope that everyone who is listening checks out the Traklight profile and looks at the availability and kind of applicability to their own sort of unique needs, because there's such a need for this. And before I let you go, you've shared a couple stories about some folks you've worked with, but I'm wondering if there's maybe one or two companies, you don't have to mention names, that were just absolute, utter disasters or problems, either because they didn't sort of address this IP need, or if there's a massive crisis that was averted because they got engaged with you and kind of navigated around a pitfall that might have swallowed them up.
Sure. So I'll tell you about the absolute disaster, and then we can end. Well, there's two disasters.
Okay.
Really quickly, there's this idea that people have that if they pay for something, they own it.
Okay.
Which, I mean, that works if you're buying lunch. It doesn't work when you're hiring somebody to do work for you if they're not an employee. So that's one of the things. And why I beg of people, just if you do nothing else, go through the free portion of Traklight. There's a version of it on MakerSource, and use that. It takes you 10 minutes, And it literally could save your company, because this one woman that I know, she did not appropriately contract with somebody. They developed software for her, and then they held the actual source code for it ransom until she paid more money, because the contract did not transfer ownership. So just be really on the alert for when you're contracting that you have appropriate contracts. The other one is that was a bit of a disaster, is very successful, and the reason I can say the name of the company is because the owner, Ian, he actually wrote a couple of blogs for me on this, trying to help other people avoid this. But one of the questions that we ask in the beginning is, do you plan to operate outside the U.S.? Because a lot of people don't understand that if you get a U.S. copyright, trademark, or patent, that's nice, but it doesn't protect you outside the U.S. And so this company is called Catlock, and they created a device. And Ian was asked by a UK company to, enter into discussions with them on this device. And he shared the information with them, but didn't have it under NDA and didn't have it specifically the right contract signed for those discussions. And the person basically took his design and started marketing it in the UK. He has patents, but his patents are only valid in the US. Mm-hmm. So not good, because he figured that out afterwards. However, a good news story to end on a positive note. One of our clients, it's called Alice, and it's a hotel app. If you think of the Brady Bunch, if you remember the Brady Bunch, the maid's name was Alice. So it helps you so it helps you when you're a hotel guest. So anyways, they had no idea that their IP protection, like their trademarks and some of the other things that they had, wouldn't work outside the U.S. And they discovered that by doing our questionnaire. So there's an article in Forbes on them too. So I think the whole theme is you don't know what you don't know, and you can't protect what you don't know you have. So that's our goal. We're not about education, but in a way we have an educational component to Traklight.
That's great. A great lesson, a great message. And one thing I want to reiterate to everyone listening is that earlier Mary had said law school. So she's not just coming at this from the sense of she saw a problem and tried to address it, but she actually knows what she's talking about. And so built Traklight around a foundation of understanding, not sort of figuring things out along the way as she went. So thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your time today. And everybody, please, 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 if you found the podcast, you know what MakerSource is, find that Traklight profile and check it out, because it could absolutely be what you need today.
Thanks very much, Bob.
All right. Thank you.